Good evening, everyone. This is Jose Niño with another episode of El Nino Speaks. And this evening, I have Mark Weber on again from the Institute for Historical Review. How's your day going, Mark?
Very good. Yeah, productive day.
Well, this topic we've been discussing off and on, like off the air, and I felt that now that after some time, and especially after rereading some of like John Mearsheimer's works and also reading the memoir of George Kennan, like his first memoir from like 1925 to 1950. I think it's only appropriate that we dedicate an episode to the renowned diplomat George Kennan. And before we start, could you give like a brief overview of who George Kennan was and what was he most known for?
Well, George Kennan is important and he's relevant today. Some unusual things. George Kennan was born in 1904 and he died in 2005. He just after his 101st birthday. So he lived a long time. But the interesting thing is he played a very important role as both a witness, an observer, and as a activist, you might say, a person involved, an official in U.S. foreign policy, especially during the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. He was an ambassador to two countries. He's biographies of him often say he's important for his most famous for his coining of the term containment in the containment policy during the Cold War. That's true, I guess, in a way, but it misses really his importance in a larger way. George Kennan is the kind of American that the founders were at the beginning of the country. He is not a typical American. His family had been farmers living in Wisconsin for 100 years or many, many years, living on their own land. And his uncle was a historian also. And George Kennan lost his mother very young. He was very intelligent, sensitive, you might say, always sort of questioning himself and questioning the impact of what he said and did with other people. But he was, and so he was not just a diplomat, he was a very good historian. He wrote a number of books, many articles, and his memoirs that you mentioned the first volume of, he wrote memoirs in two volumes from 1925 to 1950 and 1950 to 1963. They received the Pulitzer Prize because they're so exquisitely written. They're very masterfully written. He has he writes with great sort of depth and nuance in how he writes. That's because in large part, I think, because he's a person who had immersed himself in Europe. As a young man, he learned German. He lived in Germany as a young man, and he was also stationed in Germany in the 1940s and late 1930s, up until the American entry into the war in 1941. And he was very familiar with Germany, but he was also very familiar with Russia. He spoke very fluent Russian, and he had a very subtle, deep appreciation for Russian culture. Now, I mention that because not just his understanding of these two languages, which are themselves very textured languages and able to express a lot of nuance and so forth, which helped him in how he communicated in English. It's also that he had an appreciation in a deeper, more personal way about two very important nations, Germany and Russia. And that gave him a different perspective on America than many others have who are born and raised here in this country. So he was always looking at the United States and the world with a kind of detachment that very few people have. And that gives them an extraordinarily greater insight into America and its place in the world. So I'm just sort of praising him, but he's relevant here today, and he's relevant today because George Kennan was a towering exponent, a champion, for what we call now a realist foreign policy of the United States. And throughout his career, he was constantly sort of at odds with American foreign policy under Franklin Roosevelt, under Lyndon Johnson, and under other American presidents. He was a critic of much of what the U.S. Policy was. He was a critic of the Vietnam War, for example, even though he was very much a kind of part of the establishment. And the reason for that, and the reason I think it's important that we talk about him, is he opposed this idea of America as this country, a self-appointed kind of a policeman of the world. He was very much opposed to this sort of self-aggrandizing, self-important view that many Americans have about America's role in the world. I think he would be honored or listened to a great deal today if he were alive today and younger and able to articulate and so forth. The most important, probably, counterpart nowadays of George Kennan is probably John Mearsheimer, who you mentioned and who you wrote an article, a review of. Mearsheimer's probably most important book, and Stephen Walt is another. But Trump would have been today, he would have been opposed not only to the kind of crusading American foreign policy exemplified by George W. Bush, by Joe Biden in many ways, by Lyndon Johnson, by Franklin Roosevelt. He would have also opposed the purely mercantile kind of business interest foreign policy of George Bush. I'm sure he would have thought that's fails to take into account that we're talking about people and countries, not just about economic people we can deal with. In volume 2 of his memoirs, he talks about how his views are very much more in line with the founders of America, the foreign policy of non-interference in the rest of the world that George Washington laid out in his famous farewell address. And this is what Kennan writes. He said, "In such casual reading on American diplomatic history, as I had occasion to do while in government, I had been struck by the contrast between the lucid and realistic thinking of early American statesmen of the Federalist period and the cloudy bombast of their successors in later decades." Now, that sort of sums up the difference in how George Kennan viewed American foreign policy and the American place of the United States in the world compared to many others who sort of think America can sort of do what it wants in the world. We've seen displays of this not only by a range of recent presidents, but just by Donald Trump. George Kennan would have been appalled by the idea of sort of insulting foreign leaders when they're visiting in the way that Donald Trump has been, for example. Now, in addition to that, George Kennan was a very good historian. His memoirs alone are very good in that way. He wrote a thin volume, which is sort of a collection of essays called American Diplomacy, which I recommend. And it's a very good view sort of foreign affairs. And one of his best books, Russia and the West under Lenin and Stalin. And this is one of his best books about history, really. Again, George Kennan is constantly writing in such a way that he's talking about history that he knows about too, by the way, and what it means for policy, what it means for us. One of the remarkable things is even though George Kennan was constantly critical of the views of many others, even people who disagreed with him respected him because he expressed himself so cogently, so lucidly, so persuasively that nobody could really just dismiss his points of view. And that's a very important, I think, aspect of his personality. Finally, I just wanted to mention, just to start out, George Kennan became increasingly, as he got older, despairing and unhappy about what was happening in the United States. He was very unhappy about the large-scale immigration from other countries. He was very unhappy about the hyper-individualism of American life and consumerism. One book I have in my collection is a book by a historian about George Kennan's, just a book about his foreign policy views by a man named David Myers. And he's summing up about George Kennan, especially in the latter years of his life. And I'm quoting, he was also filled with revulsion at the evidence, as he understood it, of progressive and rapid deterioration in the United States. Racial strife, urban decay, pollution of the natural environment, student protests, experiments in sexual and social life suggested to Kennan that the anarchical strain in American sensibility had finally triumphed, and the national fabric was unraveling forever. The sheer extravagance of American commercialism, culture, and democracy was as bankrupt for Kennan as U.S. policy was discredited by its hopeless war in Asia. He was very critical of this kind of very solipsistic, very self-centered way that so many Americans see American society.
What year was that quote?
Well, this is a summary by another historian named David Myers, but you can find a lot of this in Kennan's journal that was published later after his death, and in the biographies. There's two major ones about George Kennan, and you'll find much more. But I'll give some other examples, even things that he actually wrote during his lifetime. He wrote to a European newspaper. He wrote, "Poor old West," means the United States, Western Europe. He wrote this in 1976. "Poor old West, succumbing feebly, day by day, to its own decadence, sliding into debility on the slime of its own self-indulgent permissiveness, its drugs, its crime, its pornography, its pampering of the youth, its addiction to its bodily comforts, its rampant materialism and consumerism." This worried him a great deal. And again, George Kennan's personality is very different. Again, he grew up not only in Wisconsin on this farm and the family homestead. His father and his family were very staunch Presbyterians. Now, the difference today between Presbyterians and Lutherans and Methodists is sort of lost on many people. They don't really sort of understand, I think, what Presbyterianism or Calvinism sort of implies. It's a much more dour, a much more a skeptical view of human nature than some other religious outlooks, Catholic or Methodist and so forth. And it's Presbyterian in background traditionally has been much less showy, more modest, you might say. And this is in keeping with the personality of George Kennan, fortified not just by his family experience, but by his religious experience. But that doesn't mean George Kennan was particularly religious, but that was an important aspect, I think, of his personality. Here's another thing. You were asking about his view about America. This is from the second volume of his memoirs. He talks about how disappointed he was visiting Southern California, driving around Southern California. And this is back in the 60s. He would be even more struck by this today.
Yeah.
Southern California, in this sense, Southern California, together with all that tendency of American life, which it typifies, it's childhood without the promise of maturity, with the promise only of continual widening and growing impressiveness of the childhood world. When the day of reckoning comes, as I think it must, it will be, as everywhere among children, the cruelest and most ruthless natures who will seek to protect their interest by enslaving others, and others, being only children, will be easily enslaved. He says Southern California society is becoming increasingly Latinized, a kind of superficial heroism and bravado, he says. He said, "California, it soon occurred to me, was like only the rest of America, but sooner and more so." And he says, "This is surely," he said, "why Americans had never really come to terms in their national philosophy with the deeper dilemmas in the predicament of man as a member of a crowded and inescapable political community." Now, what that word means is this is the way I would sort of paraphrase it. He was very struck by the tragedy of human existence. Shakespeare understood that. The ancient Greeks understood that. All sort of mature people sort of understand that. But there's an undercurrent in American life, Kennan believed, that sees everything just great and getting better. a kind of permanent adolescence, you might say. And Kennan was very contemptuous of that view. And he contrasted that with the kind of tragic sense and grim sense, you might say, that you'll find in the Russian character or German or European or well, any country which has a longer, a more established history and character and identity than the United States of America. Anyway, so Kennan, this is part of his personality, and yet one of the reasons he's so admired is because he turned out to be right about so many things.
Yes.
I mean, he predicted near the end of his life, when the Berlin Wall came down, he warned about the exuberance against to be guarded against this attitude of triumphalism, which was very common in the United States after the Berlin Wall came down. You and I have discussed this; many others have. That this was perhaps best exemplified in the famous essay and then book by Francis Fukuyama, The End of History. This idea that the end of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, vindicates this idea that America is the great model for the world. It's a great country. We've won. We're good. End of story. The history will just go on with us sort of in charge of everything. We're the model. Kennan thought that was just silly, really, and ridiculous. And anyone with a sense of history, I think, would understand that. And he warned at the time about expanding NATO eastwards against the Soviet Union. By the way, this is important because assurances were given verbally and sometimes in writing, but verbally anyway, by American and German leaders that NATO would not be expanded eastward. But it was, right up to the borders of what had been Russia. And of course, he warned there'll be a reaction. Russians aren't going to just put up with this. Russians are not people who are just going to go along with this idea that America is the great model for the world. And he was right. And so people look back and they say, well, he was right about that. But the United States had this idea, and this was expressed by many American leaders that during the 70s, 80s, 90s, that, well, if we just have international trade and we have relations with Russia and China, they'll all realize just how great America is, and it'll all sort of work out, and we'll all get along because they all realize our way of life is the way everybody ought to be. Kennan was absolutely contemptuous of this self-centered, self-aggrandizing, and childish, really, way of looking at the United States and its place in the world. He was also one of the first to warn against the Vietnam War. He said, no, there's no vital American interest involved. This idea that we have to fight Vietnam because we have to fight communism all over the world is ridiculous. He understood that even within the so-called communist world, that national interests and national and state interests are going to be more important than ideology, especially over the long run. You can have a short time of burst of ideological enthusiasm, but over the long term, national interests are going to be paramount. And he understood that. And he said the same thing that Charles de Gaulle said. Charles de Gaulle said, no, you're making a big mistake by fighting this war in Vietnam. And very few Americans want to really accept that. And I remember as a boy or a young man during the Vietnam War that Charles de Gaulle would say this. And the attitude of Americans was to say, well, who cares about that goofy Frenchman? And it shows that he's not really on board, and all sorts of very people say they would criticize the messenger rather than and nobody sort of said afterwards, well, it turns out Charles de Gaulle was right, or Kennan was right. Instead, there's this kind of thing, but let's just put it behind us and we go on to a new crusade, this time in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in some other country. We're going to make over the society and make that a new kind of subordinate or society based on the American model. That's just silly, Kennan believed, because people, just like, and countries have characters. They don't just change to fit that.
One thing that I find peculiar about George Kennan is really how history departments and international relations departments focus on his long telegram, like the paper he posted. I believe it was in Foreign Affairs under the pseudonym of X when he was working in the embassy, the American embassy in the Soviet Union. And it's like, I think, like 1946, and they only focus on that or the containment. But it's almost like the last half of his life is almost like ignored by like a lot of these conventional historians, with the exception of John Mearsheimer and some people. It's like the last half of his life has just been memory hold, like completely. Was he still in good standing when he left the government?
To sketch out his career, he began first joining the Foreign Service. He was first stationed in Riga, Latvia, and became a kind of expert because the United States didn't have an embassy in Moscow at that time, the Soviet Union. He went there with George Bullitt in 1933 to open an American embassy in Roosevelt. He was sort of unknown, really, in the U.S. Diplomatic service. He was at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin in 1941 when war finally came between the United States and Germany. He was in Prague when Czechoslovakia or Czechia became part of the German Reich. So he was at these crystal, and then he was in 1946. He was in Moscow at the U.S. Embassy in the Soviet Union, and to go about this long telegram. George Kennan wasn't even the ambassador. He was a lower official. The ambassador was gone for some reason. And the United States State Department had sent a message to the embassy saying, well, we don't understand. The Soviet Union doesn't seem to be playing ball here. They're not very cooperative with us. Because at that time, it's very important to understand, and I know it sounds astonishing today, but during World War II, the United States government took the view that Stalin and the Soviet Union was a trustworthy ally and friend of the United States, and that after the war, the United States and the Soviet Union would cooperate together to make this new world order. Now, it sounds fantastic today because it didn't work out that way, but that's what the Americans believed. And so in 46, Kennan's at the embassy in Moscow, and he gets this telegram, a kind of minor issue, really, and so he decided, I'm going to really give them an answer. And he dictated and worked with his secretary on this very lengthy assessment of the Soviet Union. And it was only later published with permission as an article under the X in the Foreign Affairs, and became much more influential. But even before it was published, copies were mimeographed and distributed within the high levels because he said if he was unknown, really. I mean, he was just a minor diplomat, not even an ambassador at the time. And if he had written this telegram a few months earlier, they would have just thought, well, he's goofy. If they'd written it a few months later, they would have thought, well, what else is new? We know this. But he was the one who put this together at a very opportune time as the Cold War was developing, as the so-called friendly relation of the United States and the Soviet Union had ended because the war had ended. And so he basically is trying to give his best analysis of why you can't just, this idea that we're just all going to get along, or that alternatively they're enemies to be crushed, are wrong. It's just a reality here. Stalin, Soviet Union, it's this big factor, and we have to deal with it very realistically. And so his telegram and his voice suddenly became important. He talks about this in his memoirs. Suddenly, he's an important guy. Everybody's, who's this George Kennan? He seems to understand it. And after that, everybody paid attention to him. And so in 1948 or 47, George Marshall, who was Secretary of State, asked him to set up a planning board in the State Department to make long-term detailed analysis of U.S. foreign policy as a guide. And then he became later ambassador to the Soviet Union, ambassador to Yugoslavia. And suddenly, and after that, his voice carries. People paid attention to him. And when he died, almost everyone spoke of him with a great deal of respect, because even as I said, people who disagreed with him thought, well, this is a man who, when he said something, he had a good reason to say it, and he knew what he was talking about. And even if you disagree with him, you better have some good reasons to disagree with him, because this person is not somebody to be dismissed just out of hand.
One thing about George Kennan too, as you mentioned before, is like he lived a very long life, like 101 years. So he's pretty much seen it all. He saw the US when it was a country that's about to become the regional hegemon, experience its ascent into superpower status, and the experience the tumultuous cultural revolution of the 1960s, of which we still are feeling the effects of the many social, racial, and cultural transformations that took place in that decade. So he's largely seen it all. And I I think that he is like a figure that's like of a bygone era. He's like a kind of like Renaissance man of sorts that you just don't see holding public office, much less is part of like the permanent bureaucracy that dictates like long-term planning for foreign policy. He's almost like an extinct species in DC. Towards the end of his life, did he basically just kind of like give up on the US as like a functional polity that he believed was just going to be on the path to like chaos within like a decade or so?
Well, he was very skeptical about democracy, at least the kind of democracy we have in America, because he says, I mean, again, he's not alone. Many people have made these observations, but people who talk like this, politicians don't want to listen to. Basically, the American political system requires that and for somebody to get into political office, they've got to make extravagant promises to people. They've got to tell them things they don't even believe themselves. They've got to say, oh, it's going to be great. It's going to be wonderful. Vote for me. I'm going to do this for you. And he felt this is silly, really, because the average person votes for people who are making decisions about matters they don't know anything about on the basis of the promises they make. He felt, and again, when I was quoting earlier about how he thought he was impressed by the lucidity, the cogency, the coherence of U.S. foreign policy in the Federalist era, that's before democracy, you might say, really took hold in America. So George Kennan, yeah, I'll say he's out of step. He would have been out of step with Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump. None of them, they would have said, I mean, to be crude, Donald Trump would have said, well, hey, how much money you got, buddy? I mean, show me how big you are. What do you got to show for your life? And Kennan, Biden would have said, Kennan didn't care about that. He didn't care really about money. He had a farm, even when he was working in Washington, D.C., he had a place up in Maryland that he liked to fix up. It was a farm, and he tried to run it on the weekends. He's a man, he liked working with his hands and so forth. I'm going to make, this is a quote from this book, Russia in the West under Lenin and Stalin. He says, and this is about a problem of democracy. He says, let me assure you, nothing in nature more egotistical than the embattled democracy. It soon becomes the victim of its own war propaganda. It then tends to attach to its own cause an absolute value, which distorts its own vision of everything else. Its enemy becomes the embodiment of all evil. Its own side, on the other hand, is the center of all virtue. The contest comes to be viewed as having a final apocalyptic quality. Now, this is a point many others have made. When the United States goes to war, the presidents tell people, we've got to stop these bad guys because they're going to be taking over the whole world. And so there's always a new Hitler. There's always somebody who's going to take over the world, as ridiculous as that was with Hitler. But I remember this when I was during the Vietnam War. Johnson told everybody, well, if we don't stop them in South Vietnam, well, they'll be coming down through Malaysia, and they'll be in Indonesia. Next thing they'll be taking Australia. They'll be taking one place after another, and we'll have to. And then George W. Bush during the run up to the Gulf War, he said, "Oh, we got to stop this Saddam Hussein now. He's going to be a threat, and we can't wait until he shows it with a mushroom cloud of using atomic bomb, nuclear weapon." I mean, all this was just wildly crazy. But the American public, in order to get behind a foreign war, has to be told these extravagant, exaggerated threats that have no relationship to the real reality, because the average person doesn't really want to change anything until he's threatened. Another part of one of his books, George Kennan compared to the United States, democratic America, to an enormous dinosaur who has a very tiny brain, and you can only get his attention by just whacking him and hitting his tail until finally he turns around and wonders what's going on. So George Kennan was, as you say, he was just out of step with America. And we're seeing increasingly Americans have a hard time understanding what went wrong. And George Kennan and I, and many others, would say, well, this has been the decline of America has been building for a long time, because the emphasis is so much on what's for me, what's in it for me. I want things to be comfortable and nice. This is not a society that's really serious about any larger efforts and undertakings. But yeah, anyway, that's what I'd say in answer to the point you're making here.
Mm-hmm. Another point that I also believe is overlooked about Kennan that would make him completely out of step with the present foreign policy consensus in Washington, D.C., is the fact that he was always skeptical of the establishment of the state of Israel. He was one of the main voices that was in opposition to the 1948 partition plan. And it was also funny too, because of somebody of his stature opposing that. And I believe George Marshall was also opposed to the establishment of Israel. What was the rationale that Kennan used to oppose the U.S.'s recognition of Israel in 1948?
Well, in 1948, the Zionists in Israel declared the state of Israel, a Jewish state. And in the months coming up to this, everybody knew this was coming, because the British, who had controlled Palestine from after World War I, were bankrupt. They said, we can't handle it anymore. We're washing our hands of the whole thing. We're leaving. And the Zionist Jews, the Jewish agency, said, well, when this happens, when the British leave, we're going to declare a Jewish state in Palestine. And the question that Harry Truman, who was president, faced was, should the United States recognize this new Jewish state? Now, it's hard to put yourself today in the mindset of people at that time, because people take for granted, well, of course, Israel's there and so forth. But at the time, Harry Truman was facing this problem because everyone who was concerned really about foreign policy, not domestic policy, but foreign policy, said the United States should not even recognize this Jewish state, because it's a small group of people, a minority, declaring they have their own government in a country that overwhelmingly doesn't want them to have a government. Palestine was an overwhelmingly non-Jewish people and state and country. And the people there didn't want anybody else setting up a separate thing. It'd be like, let's suppose Indian tribes all said, we're going to declare an Indian or Native American Republic of America, and whether foreign countries should recognize it or not. But anyway, my point is, not just George Marshall was Secretary of State. He was one of the most honored men in American history. He had been basically the head of the military during the Second World War. And he was furious that Truman was even considering recognizing the state of Israel. And at the time, and the Secretary of Defense, they consolidated the Secretary, he was recognizing Israel. And George Kennan, as head of the Policy Planning Board of the State Department, also said, now, why did they do that? Why did they oppose it? They did it for two main reasons. First, they said that it's contrary to even the principles we claim to uphold. We're supposedly in favor of democracy. It's not democratic for Palestine. Palestinians don't want these people who have come into the country declaring that they're the rulers of the country. It's not their country. And if we support Israel on that basis, we make a mockery of our pretensions to support for democracy and determination and so forth. Second, and there was a long memo written by a very high-ranking State Department official just a few months before the State of Israel declared by Lloyd Henderson. And he predicted what would happen. He said, if we recognize the State of Israel, we're going to be committed to this country. And their enemies are going to be our enemies. We won't be able to disengage from the thing. We're going to be stuck trying to defend and uphold a country that is not really in our interest. And this is a main point that Kennan, Marshall, Forrestal all said. Supporting this Jewish state isn't in the American national interest. It's not in the world interest, but it's certainly not in America's national interest. Now, the reason why this question is good is because we're finding this to be an existential question now that people are dealing with. People are asking, okay, Israel's hammering away at these people. They want ethnic cleansing. They were doing the Zionists who took over were ethnically cleansing as much as they could in 1948. That was another thing, the reason why people didn't want to support Israel. And now, of course, it's on television. And you can see it, and there's pictures everywhere. So now it's more in our face than it was in 1948. But so people ask, and Donald Trump is a kind of businessman. So he says, what's in it for us? What's in it for me? I go to Saudi Arabia or Qatar, and they give me presents. They say nice things. They sign deals. They buy things. I go to Israel, and I get complaints. I get people wanting more. So what's in it for us? I mean, Donald Trump is putting it in a kind of personal way, but in a larger way, this was what really was at stake. And so the U.S. support for Israel, as I think everybody knows, the United States has given more military and economic aid to Israel than any other single country in history. And what do we have to show for it? Well, what's the advantage? Well, people give some kind of silly reasons. Well, because the Bible says so and so forth. That's not much of a reason to make foreign policy. If you want to be consistent, they should apply in other ways, but they don't. But anyway, that's basically the reason why Kennan and everyone really who knew about the world really said, this is not in our interest, and it's a betrayal of our own principles to even recognize, much less militarily support the state of Israel.
Just to piggyback off of this, Kennan has talked a lot about domestic politics, contrary to the perception that he was only exclusively commentating on foreign affairs. Did he ever talk about Jewish influence, like the influence of organized Jewry in the United States, especially in the 60s when it became pretty stark?
Well, that's a big thing that happened when, after he died, his diaries were published. And biographers and people who reviewed and talked about it were sort of appalled that he said some critical things about Jews. And so now, he wasn't any sort of hateful person. He wasn't obsessed by it. But he took the view that the Jewish community regards itself as a special group. And the Jewish community is as fixated on its own communitarian interests as any group in America or the world. And so that is inevitably going to cause a clash with other peoples, including the people, the countries among whom they live, among whom Jews live, except in Israel itself, of course. So Kennan was basically, his view of Jews was one that Jews implicitly have of themselves. They're a separate people, and they therefore have separate interests, and their interests are not the same as our interests. That's basically George Kennan's view. Now, and he also, he had a kind of idea about America that basically it should be a European, Christian, sort of country, and he did not want the country changing. He would have been even more astonished by the demographic change that has taken place since his death in 2005. Just in the past 20 years, there's been even more trajectory in that direction. And he would have thought, I think he would have taken a view, would have held a view very similar to the one that I have, that this thing called the United States of America, in spite of all of the all the enthusiasm for Donald Trump, it's not salvageable. It's already too divided. It's too fractured. It's already too diverse to really be a stable country over a long run. Now, again, it can go on for a long time. This has happened in history. It happened with the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Soviet Empire. They all broke down ultimately for reasons that are a problem here in America. People don't, they're not the same, and so they don't trust each other. And it's very hard to unify people coherently for national purposes when people are as different as they are in the United States. I wanted to mention something else about Kennan too. He doesn't hammer away at it, but in his memoirs and in other writings, he had a very different view of modern history that is quite at odds with how the official kind of view of history is. For example, in his first volume of memoirs, he talks about Hitler's attack against the Soviet Union. And not just Hitler, also it was carried out with Finland, Romania, and then with Hungary, Italy, all these other countries. And he talks about how Hitler almost had no choice. He had no choice. He said, one must not forget to what extent Hitler's final decision to attack Russia was influenced by the stubborn greediness of Soviet diplomacy, especially with regard to Finland and Bulgaria, as revealed in the talks with Molotov in November 1940, and by the very numerical enormity of the armed forces that Stalin was then maintaining along Russia's western frontier. Hitler dared not leave so imposing a force intact on his flank at a time when his inability to invade the British Isle was compelling him to widen his strategy into attack against Britain's Mediterranean lifeline. At another point, he talks about the blind stubbornness of the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, who insisted on complete Soviet military control of Bulgaria and other countries. And he says, demands so greedy and extreme that they would convince Hitler he had no choice but to attempt to eliminate Russia as a factor in the world situation. I mean, see, in other words, Hitler isn't just sitting around thinking of new countries we're going to take over. He faced a real dilemma. The Soviet military by 1941 was by far the world's largest air force, largest tank force. And this was directed at the West. Anyway, Kennan understands that. This is another thing he talks about, too, in his memoirs. He's talking about, well, how is it that Hitler had this so much support? He said, and again, he lived in Germany during this period of time. He was in Berlin in 1937, 38, 39, 40, 41. Anyway, this period. And he said, many people in Germany and Austria who were at first skeptical or even hostile to the new Hitler government were finally overpowered both by the emotional impetus of the movement and by the success Hitler had in achieving, by relatively bloodless means, objectives which the Weimar Republic, the previous government, had not been able to achieve in many years of restrained effort. The overcoming of the economic crisis, the program for employment and public works, the rectification of many of the restrictions imposed on Germany by the Versailles settlement, all these things which had proved beyond the power of the Weimar Republic, the democratic government, Hitler accomplished without war in the space of a few years. So impressive were these results that even Germans who had detested everything Hitler stood for vacillated and asked themselves whether this man was not indeed, behind all the demagoguery, a genius. Now, see, in other words, he's not a fan of Hitler, but he's trying to understand how is it that this person had this broad and deep a level of public support. Another thing here, too, that I wanted to read. Yeah, he talks about the Nuremberg trials. at the end of the war. He called them a horror. He said the only implication, this procedure, that is the big international tribunal that put the German leaders on trial and executed most of them, the only implication this procedure can convey was, after all, that such crimes were justifiable and forgivable when committed by the leaders of one government under one set of circumstances, but unjustifiable and unforgivable, and to be punished by death when committed by another set of government leaders under another set of circumstances. In other words, he was appalled by the rank hypocrisy and double standard of the United States, France, the Soviet Union, in taking these, in America, and putting these leaders on trial and executing for acts which the American government and certainly the Soviet government were likewise guilty of. Another quote, too, he talks about at the end of the war, and this is a point that very few Americans are really aware of, and that is the devastating, destructive power of the Soviets when they moved into Europe in 1944-45 at the end of the war, into Europe, and how much destruction. And he's talking about the Red Army and the Soviets going into Eastern Germany. The disaster that befell this area with the entry of the Soviet forces, I'm quoting Kennan, has no parallel in modern European experience. There were considerable sections of it where, to judge by all existing evidence, scarcely a man, woman, or child of the indigenous population was left alive after the initial passage of Soviet forces. The economic life of the place was shattered beyond belief. I myself flew low in an American plane over the entire province shortly after Potsdam, the Potsdam Conference, and the sight of that was of a totally ruined and deserted country, scarcely a sign of life from one end to the other. The Red Army, he said, swept the native population clean in a manner that has had no parallel since the days of the Asiatic hordes. Now, again, this is a whole chapter that Americans hear very little about, know very little about. But Kennan was very sensitive to this and very aware of all of this. He paid attention to this. Another interesting passage is also the plans that were made in Europe during the in 1940, 41, 42, 43 by leaders in Germany and the other countries allied with Germany for what was going to happen after the war. Their plans for a post-war Europe, expecting, of course, that they would be the victors. And he writes in his memoir, this is the first volume, when stationed in Berlin during the war, I had been struck with the fact that Hitler himself, albeit for the wrong reasons and in the wrong spirit, had actually accomplished much of the technical task of the unification of Europe. He had created central authorities in a whole series of areas, in transportation, in banking, in procurement and distribution of raw materials, in the control of various forms of nationalized property. Why, I ask myself, could this situation not be usefully exploited after an Allied victory? In other words, he thought that the Americans should learn from what the Germans were doing or planning during the war itself. Anyway, those are just a few quotes, and they give some feeling, a sense of how not only is the you might say personality of Kennan different than many others at the time, his perspective on what was happening, both at the time and historically, is a much more broader, higher one than you'll get from most American historians or diplomats at the time, who are sort of triumphalist that we won, and that's
very emotional
discussion.
Yeah.
Very much more emotional and superficial.
Yes, this type of analysis that you see, like I mentioned before, Kennan is just really operating on a different astral plane than most people. Like I'd even say most of his contemporaries, to be honest, but like definitely among people that occupy similar positions today in the foreign policy sphere, because people cannot analyze things in a value-free manner. It's very much informed by the triumphalist liberal international priors that became the norm after the end of World War II, and only accelerated after the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
I want to make a point about American foreign policy. I mean, we have Madeleine Albright, we've had Hillary Clinton. I'm mentioning secretaries of state. We've had Mario Rubio. All of these people really are very much narrower in their perspective on the world than you'll find in somebody like, in contrast to somebody like George Kennan. But that's not my main point. My point is it's a larger structural problem. One of the most interesting books on international relations and other things too that I've read over the years, I've read several times, is the memoirs of Nahum Goldman. Nahum Goldman was a diplomat for Israel and for the Zionist. He was president of the World Zionist Organization, the World Jewish Congress, and he was the person who negotiated the famous 1952 Luxembourg Agreement, whereby Germany paid reparations to Israel and to Jewish organizations. Now, I'm not saying because he's a good guy or bad guy, but he's a perceptive person, and his memoirs are very illuminating. And he writes in his memoirs that he dealt with diplomats from many different countries over the years. And he said the most impressive diplomats in terms of their awareness, their subtlety, their the vantage point that they looked at issues, he said, was the Vatican. Their diplomats take a view not by a few years, but by decades and centuries. They have a much more larger view of how things are playing out and will play out. And he says the worst are from democratic countries because they are elected. I mean, they come in with each election. And so there's some
short time windows.
People, yeah, they have short things, and they're always conscious of what they do in terms of how it's going to be for the next election. And so he says that inevitably their perspective is a very short-term one, a very narrow one. And again, he's not anti-democratic, obviously, but he contrasts that the more, quote, democratic, the more it's all tied up with politics, the less able the leaders of the country and its diplomats are able to make policy for long-term interests of the country and the people and the world. And that's important. I would contrast, just make the observation that right now, much of the world is contrasting the almost up and down roller coaster foreign policy of the Trump administration on the one hand, and the kind of quiet, steady policy that China has, the biggest rival, you might say, of the United States in the world today. I mean, again, it's not a thing that I love China, although I think we should learn from China. It's that the Chinese have a fairly consistent, predictable way of laying out what they want and then their relations with other countries. Whereas the United States, and they don't insult leaders of foreign countries in the way the United States, especially this president, does. Anyway, the point is, a country's, much of its strength in the world, much of its influence is based on its credibility, its trustworthiness. And when a country loses that, when people don't believe the leaders anymore, when a country and its leaders are no longer trustworthy, that's a tremendous defect and a very big disadvantage. And I dare say that this will come, unhappily, much more apparent that this up and down, back and forth unpredictability has very harmful consequences, which we will see in the next several years for the United States and indeed for the world.
Do you see, outside of John Mearsheimer, do you see any public intellectual, not just like in the US, but in the West in general, that like holds a torch to Kennan, like in terms of like intellect?
Stephen Walt is very good. Stephen Walt's good. And I think there's probably many others who are not so well known. Well, Mearsheimer and Walt, but particularly where Mearsheimer goes on television a lot, or he gets interviewed, and he's more of a kind of public academic than than some of these others. But there are people. I mean, again, this is a big problem. There's many people around the country who understand these kinds of points, who admire that, but they don't get a lot of attention because the way they talk isn't given to headlines and it's not sensational. Um, I'll mention another thing that Kennan mentions in his book. Uh, in the early Cold War period, he would go around the United States and speak to public groups. He would speak to academics, professors, international relations people, people at different universities, and he would speak to citizens groups and businessmen groups and other groups. And he said that he writes about how the people he had the most trouble with were academics, scholars, because the overwhelming feeling of in the intellectual community in the 1950s and 60s was that the United States and the Soviet Union should sort of come together. They should sort of work out everything, and it'll all sort of work together. And he said they're just completely naive, really, and ignorant, really, about the Soviet Union, about Russia, about the nature of the whole thing. But they were so fixated, he said, on this idea they had about what ought to be, not what is, but what ought to be, that it was very difficult even to converse with them. On the other hand, he said, the people who were who listened most attentively and with the most respect to what he had to say were businessmen, because at least they can see, well, okay, they've got different interests, and something like Trump. At least you can work out something. It isn't motivated by a kind of childish belief that, well, it's all going to work out if we just be nice to each other, something like that. And we can see parallels of that today in the academic community. There's this idea in domestic policy. Well, if we're just all very kind and good and we love each other, it'll all sort of work out, whatever the problem happens to be. Again, George Kennan would have just been contemptuous of that not only naive but self-important, self-righteous kind of way of looking at both foreign affairs and domestic policy.
Well, I think this is a good place to put a bookmark in this conversation, but I thought it was very intellectually stimulating as always, Mark. And also, before we leave, let the audience know what you have planned for IHR.
Well, we're working on a number of things, and including expansion of our presence on social media. This is difficult, of course. We have this, there's a kind of ban on the IHR in YouTube and some other places, so we're working on that. I'll be giving a talk at a conference in a week, and looking forward to that. I think that'll be important. Of course, I do a weekly podcast with a colleague, Frody Midjord in Europe, that I urge people to listen to if they want as well. And of course, we're doing our routine work all the time of distributing and selling books, discs, and so forth, updating the website. Those are sort of standard things we do. But anyway, that's just what's going on right now, I would say.
All right. Thank you again for taking the time out of your day to have this conversation. And to the audience, thank you for your attention. And with that, El Nino has spoken.